Imagine a world where the machines humanity sent into space came back, decided we were the problem, and the only thing standing between extinction and survival was a ragtag group of scavengers who refused to quit. And somehow, that group ended up going toe-to-toe with the most powerful military force in human history. Before I move forward, I'm counting on you to support my channel by clicking that tiny subscribe button so that we can spread these amazing videos to folks like you around the world. Thank you. So this video came together because I kept running into a question that the Ark Raiders community never fully answered. What actually happens when Ark stops being just a survival threat and starts looking like something the US Army would mobilize against? I spent a long time going through in-game documents, environmental details, and faction dialogue, and I made one deliberate choice when assembling this. I put the military escalation thread front and center, even though a lot of lore channels focus on the Ark machines themselves. That felt like the more interesting story to me, because the machines are terrifying, sure, but humans going to war with each other while Ark is still falling from the sky, that is the part that keeps you up at night. This is my interpretation of that story, pieced together from fragments, and some of it points in directions the game only hints at. Let's get into it. Chapter 1. The World Before the Rain. The world that Ark Raiders describes did not collapse overnight. The evidence scattered across the game's environments suggests a slow unwinding, a civilization that had every warning sign and still managed to miss most of them. Underground bunkers were not built in a panic. They were constructed over years, funded quietly, populated carefully, and stocked with enough supplies to suggest that someone in a position of authority knew something was coming long before the general population did. The people who ended up underground were not necessarily the wealthiest or the most powerful. Some of them were, certainly, but the lore points toward a selection process that was at least partially meritocratic, at least in the early stages, where engineers, doctors, agronomists, and soldiers were prioritized alongside administrators and officials. The surface world before Ark's arrival was recognizable as our own. Just slightly further along the road most of us are already on. Climate pressures had reshaped coastlines and agricultural zones. Political fractures that had been widening for decades had finally split into something closer to open rivalry between major power blocks. The United States, or what the lore suggests is its successor state, maintained a significant military apparatus that had adapted to these new pressures. It was leaner in some ways, more automated in others, and deeply invested in the kind of technology that would eventually make it one of the few institutions capable of organized resistance when Ark arrived. Before Ark, the world had already begun sending things into space at a pace that would have seemed extraordinary. Even 20 years prior, private launch companies, national programs, and international collaborations had seeded the orbital environment with thousands of objects, satellites, stations, research platforms, manufacturing rigs. The lore does not give a precise count, but the scale implied by the fallen infrastructure you find on the surface suggests something enormous. These were not small installations. Some of the wreckage players encounter hints at structures that must have been the size of stadiums when they were intact, now broken into debris fields that still glow faintly with residual power. What happened to those structures is the starting point of everything. The game never gives you a clean explanation, which feels deliberate. One reading of the available fragments is that something came into contact with orbital infrastructure and changed it. Not destroyed it, changed it. The machines that fall from the sky in Ark Raiders are not random debris. They are organized. They have behavior. They have what looks disturbingly like purpose. And that purpose does not appear to be incidental. The structures they came from were built by humans, but what they became was something else entirely. The transition period, the years between whatever happened in orbit and the moment Ark rain became a regular feature of life on the surface, is one of the most interesting gaps in the lore. Something had to happen during that window. Governments would have detected anomalies, military organizations would have begun assessments, scientists would have tried to communicate, to understand, to intervene. The law suggests that at least some of these attempts were made. There are fragments that point toward early contact protocols, toward attempts to shut down or redirect whatever was happening in orbit. None of them worked. That failure is important because it's not presented as a catastrophic mistake or a moment of hubris. It reads more like a door that simply would not open, no matter how hard anyone knocked. Underground construction accelerated during this window. The law implies that the decision to go subsurface was not made by one government or one institution. It was made independently, in parallel, by multiple groups who reached the same conclusion at roughly the same time. That convergence is interesting because it suggests the threat was becoming legible even without official communication. People who were paying attention could see what was coming. The question was always whether they had enough time and enough resources to do anything meaningful about it. The social texture of pre-descent society is something the law sketches rather than paints. You get impressions more than details. A world that was tired, that had been managing crises for so long that crisis management had become the primary mode of governance. A world where people had learned to be skeptical of large institutions even as they depended on them completely. A world where the gap between what officials said and what was actually happening had grown wide enough that a significant portion of the population simply assumed they were not being told the truth about ARC. Some of them were right, others were wrong in ways that still managed to get them killed. The military's role in this pre-descent period is one of the threads I found most interesting when assembling this narrative. The fragments suggest that armed forces were among the last institutions to formally commit to underground operations, not because they were slow to understand the threat, but because their doctrine required them to maintain a surface presence for as long as operationally possible. You do not abandon territory. You do not cede the surface. These are deep institutional convictions, and the law suggests they created genuine tension between military leadership and civilian administrators who wanted to move faster. That tension had consequences. Some of the bunker complexes in the game show evidence of being built in stages, with later expansions that look rushed and less precisely engineered than the initial construction. One possible reading is that these expansions happened when military units finally committed to going underground later than the original planners had anticipated, requiring hasty enlargement of facilities that were not designed to accommodate full combat units alongside civilian populations. The integration of armed forces into underground communities created its own set of complications that the law only begins to unpack. What the early fragments most clearly suggest is that the world did not end. It relocated. The surface became hostile territory, but humanity did not disappear from it. Some people chose to stay or had no choice, or arrived too late to find a place underground. Others emerged periodically for resources. The concept of the raider, the surface scavenger who ventures out to recover what the world left behind, did not spring up after ARC. It was baked into the survival model from the beginning. Someone always had to go up there. Someone always had to face what was falling from the sky. The question that this whole story turns on is what happens when that someone starts running into organized military opposition that was supposed to be on the same side. The first generation of underground inhabitants were, broadly speaking, a community shaped by shared emergency. The law suggests a kind of enforced solidarity in those early years, a recognition that survival required cooperation, that the old categories of wealth and status were at least partially suspended in favor of functional contribution. Engineers mattered, farmers mattered, soldiers mattered in a specific, defined way. That initial social contract is important because understanding how it eroded tells you almost everything about the conflict that eventually emerged. Resource management was the first major source of friction. The bunker systems were not infinitely sustainable. They were designed with specific population loads and specific supply assumptions. And when those assumptions met reality, they did not always hold up. Crop failures, equipment failures, demographic shifts, the unexpected survival of surface populations who eventually found their way to bunker entrances looking for shelter. All of these pressures pushed against the original design parameters and created situations where the people in charge had to make hard choices about allocation. The military, as an institution, had a natural advantage in resource allocation conflicts. It was organized, hierarchical, and in possession of the means to enforce decisions. The law suggests that in some bunker communities this advantage was exercised with restraint, that military leadership genuinely tried to serve the broader population. In others, something different emerged. The concentration of decision-making authority in armed groups, combined with genuine scarcity, produced outcomes that the game's environmental storytelling depicts without much editorializing. You find the evidence and you draw your own conclusions about what happened in certain facilities. The surface, meanwhile, was changing. ARC's campaign was not static. The machines that came down did not simply destroy and move on. They operated in patterns that observers began to document over time, and those patterns suggested something more systematic than random destruction. Certain areas were cleared repeatedly. Certain structures were left standing, while everything around them was leveled. Certain resources, particularly metals and electronics, appeared to be collected rather than destroyed. The law does not give you a clean theory to explain this behavior, but it points toward the possibility that ARC was engaged in something, some kind of project, some kind of ongoing operation that the surface destruction was in service of. Understanding that possibility is crucial to understanding why the military eventually shifted its posture toward ARC from simple defensive containment to something more aggressive. If ARC is just destroying things, you defend against it. If ARC is building something, or gathering something, or preparing for a second phase of whatever it is doing, then the calculus changes. You start to think about interdiction. You start to think about what it would mean to actually contest the surface, not just survive below it. That shift in thinking is where this story really begins, and it is a shift that the raider communities were already living through by the time military planners started seriously considering it. The raiders, the people who went to the surface regularly and came back, had a knowledge base that underground military planners did not. They knew the terrain. They knew where ARC machines concentrated and where they did not. They knew which routes were safe at which times. They knew what was worth salvaging and what was too dangerous to approach. That knowledge was enormously valuable, and the law suggests it was recognized as such fairly early. The relationship between raider communities and underground military structures was in the beginning largely cooperative. Information for protection, salvage for supplies. It seemed like a sustainable arrangement. What complicated it was the gap between what raiders were learning on the surface and what military institutions were willing to officially acknowledge. Raiders were picking up evidence of things that did not fit the approved threat model. Evidence that ARC was not behaving randomly. Evidence that certain surface locations held something other than simple debris and wreckage. Evidence that the machines had a structure, a hierarchy, a set of priorities that could be observed and potentially exploited. When this evidence made its way underground, it did not always receive a warm reception. Institutions that have committed to a particular understanding of a threat tend to be resistant to information that complicates that understanding. That resistance is one of the most human elements of the ARC Raiders lore. The machines are extraordinary and terrifying, but the story that runs underneath the surface conflict is a story about how organizations process inconvenient information and what happens when the people closest to the problem know things that the people making decisions refuse to accept. It is not a story about evil, Most of the people involved were trying to do the right thing. It is a story about how institutional logic can lead to outcomes that nobody intended, and nearly everyone would have opposed if they had been able to see the whole picture at once. The early raider generations built their own culture, their own knowledge systems, their own sense of what the surface meant and what it demanded. This is evident in the equipment designs, the communication protocols, the naming conventions that show up in the game's artifacts. It is a culture shaped by intimacy with danger, by the specific experience of moving through a world that is actively hostile in ways that require constant adaptation. The surface is not just dangerous, it is legible to those who have learned to read it. And the ability to read it is something that cannot be transferred by briefing document or training simulation. It requires time. It requires presence. It requires a particular kind of relationship with a place that wants you dead. The military understood this intellectually and struggled with it institutionally. Doctrine written for a pre-arc world did not map cleanly onto the operational realities of the surface. Units trained in conventional or even unconventional warfare found that their assumptions about terrain, visibility, engagement ranges, and threat behavior needed to be completely rebuilt from scratch. The law suggests that some units adapted brilliantly, others did not. The ones that did not tended to take casualties that then fed back into the institutional resistance to surface operations, creating a cycle where every failure became evidence for the case that the surface was not worth contesting at any price. The raiders watching this developed a particular perspective on military institutional culture that would later have significant consequences. They saw institutions that claimed to be preparing for surface operations but were actually, in the judgment of people who lived those operations daily, preparing to fail at them. The knowledge gap between surface-experienced raiders and underground-based military planners was not just a practical problem. It was a cultural problem. And cultural problems do not get solved by issuing new equipment or revising training schedules. What the law most clearly suggests about this early period is that the seeds of later conflict were already present in the structure of the relationship between raiders and military institutions from the very beginning. Not because anyone was malicious, not because either group was fundamentally wrong about the threat, but because two communities with different knowledge bases, different risk tolerances, and different institutional logics were being pushed by circumstances toward a collision that neither of them had time to prevent. Ark was the context. The conflict between Ark and the human survivors was the frame. But the story inside that frame was always, at its heart, a story about what happens when the people who know the most have the least power, and the people with the most power know the least. The final years before open conflict were characterized by a kind of unstable equilibrium. Raiders and military units coexisted on the surface in a relationship that was formally cooperative and informally tense. Information sharing continued, but it was increasingly selective. Raiders learned which things they could report and which things would cause problems. Military units learned which raider groups were reliable and which were unreliable by their own definitions, which often had more to do with compliance than competence. The surface became not just a contested zone between humans and Ark, but a contested zone between different visions of what human survival should look like. Ark itself, meanwhile, continued its campaign with a consistency that was almost contemptuous of human politics. The machines did not care about the tensions developing among their targets. They operated according to whatever logic drove them, and that logic did not include any adjustment for the fact that the humans below were arguing about authority and resources. The Ark campaign was the one constant, the one thing that everyone agreed was real and dangerous and ongoing, and it is a particular kind of tragic irony that the shared threat was not enough to prevent the conflict that was building underneath it. The underground communities in this period were not monolithic. Different bunker systems had developed different governance models. different resource allocation approaches, different relationships with their raider populations. Some had evolved towards something resembling genuine partnership with surface operators. Others had moved toward tighter control, more hierarchical structures, more explicit subordination of raider activity to military command authority. The diversity of these arrangements meant that, when the broader conflict finally arrived, it did not look the same everywhere. It was not a single war with a single front. It was a series of local conflicts shaped by local histories, local grievances, and local power structures. The law suggests that the trigger, when it came, was not a dramatic incident. It was a policy decision, a decision made underground by people who had access to certain kinds of information and not others, that fundamentally changed the relationship between raider communities and the military structures they had been operating alongside. Understanding that decision, what drove it, what assumptions it rested on, and how raider communities on the surface experienced it, is the core of the next chapter of this story. What the early law gives us then is a world that collapsed in ways that were both extraordinary and completely recognizable. The extraordinary part was Ark. The recognizable part was everything that happened among the humans trying to survive it. Institutions behaving like institutions, communities developing identities in opposition to each other, knowledge being weaponized, authority being asserted and resisted. The specific setting is science fiction. The dynamics are not. The surface world at the end of this early period was a place that had been transformed but not emptied. It held secrets that no one fully understood. It held resources that everyone needed. It held evidence of what Ark was actually doing that the game only partially reveals. And it held human communities that had built themselves around the specific demands of surviving on that surface, communities that were about to discover that the underground structures they had counted on for support were reconceiving the relationship in ways that would not be mutual. That is where the next part of this story begins, with a policy document, with a meeting that probably happened in a room without much natural light, with a decision that the people who made it thought was rational and necessary, and that the people who received it experienced as a declaration of a different kind of war than the one they had been fighting. The machines were still falling from the sky, and something on the ground was about to break open. The raiders of this period left records, not official ones, the kind that get scratched into walls and tucked into waterproof containers and passed between people who trust each other. The law fragments that come from this source have a different texture than the official documents. They are more specific, more human, more concerned with the particular than the general. They name people. They remember meals and weather and the specific way a particular machine sounded before it saw you. They are the record of people who are paying very close attention to a world that most of the people making decisions about them had never personally experienced. Those records suggest that the surface community, as fractured and diverse as it was, shared a common understanding of certain things. They understood Ark's rhythms better than anyone underground. They understood which structures had been altered and which had been left alone and what that pattern might mean. They understood that the surface was not simply a hostile wasteland to be endured. It was a place with a logic to it, a terrible and alien logic, but a logic nonetheless. And they were beginning to develop theories about that logic that had implications far beyond simple survival. When those theories started reaching the wrong ears, the equilibrium broke, not dramatically, not with a single incident that everyone would later point to. It broke the way most things break, slowly and then all at once, through an accumulation of small decisions that each seemed reasonable in isolation and were catastrophic in combination. By the time anyone was in a position to see the whole shape of what was happening, it was too late to address it through normal channels. The channels themselves were part of the problem. Ark kept falling. The surface kept changing. And somewhere in the gap between the people who understood what was happening and the people who had the power to do something about it. The conflict that would eventually look like a war was assembling itself piece by piece, with no one individual responsible for any of it, and all of them responsible for all of it. That is the world this story is set in. That is the ground this story grows from. Everything that follows is a consequence of everything described here, and the tragedy of it is that almost none of it was inevitable. The early law, taken as a whole, suggests a civilization that was not destroyed by Ark. It was stressed, damaged, and fundamentally transformed. But transformation is not destruction. The humans who went underground took their institutions with them. Their hierarchies, their conflicts, their capacity for both extraordinary cooperation and extraordinary self-defeat. The machines that fell from the sky were alien and implacable. The humans who faced them were entirely, completely human. And that, more than anything else, is what made the situation so dangerous. Because Ark you can try to understand. Ark you can study. Ark operates according to whatever principles drive it. And those principles, however alien, are at least consistent. Humans operating under pressure, with incomplete information, competing interests, and the weight of old institutional cultures pressing on every decision they make. That is the variable that no simulation adequately captures. That is the element that the most sophisticated military planning always underestimates. Not the machines, the people. Always the people. And the people, by the end of this opening chapter, were heading somewhere that none of them would have chosen if they could have seen it clearly. The raiders on the surface, the soldiers in the underground corridors, the administrators trying to hold fractured systems together, the scientists piecing together theories about Ark from fragments that were never designed to be understood. All of them moving toward each other. All of them shaped by a world that had already changed beyond recognition. All of them about to discover that the war they thought they were fighting was not the only war that was coming. Chapter 2. Ark's nature and the machine mind. There is a question that runs under almost every piece of Ark Raiders lore like a current, and it is this: is Ark aware of us? Not in a simple sensor detection way. Everyone agrees the machines can detect humans. The question is whether whatever drives Ark has something resembling a model of humanity, an understanding of what we are, what we want, and why we behave the way we do. The answer the law points toward is complicated, and the complication matters enormously for everything that follows. The machines that fall from the sky are not a single type. The Ark Raiders' environment is populated with a range of machine variants, and the differences between them are not merely aesthetic. The law suggests that different machine types have different behavioral profiles, different operational priorities, and different responses to human presence. Some variants appear primarily focused on resource processing. Others seem oriented toward area denial. Others exhibit what can only be described as investigative behavior, moving through environments in patterns that suggest they are looking for something specific, though what that something is remains unclear. What makes Ark's machine mind interesting from a law perspective is that it does not appear to be centrally coordinated in any way humans would recognize. There is no single command structure that the machines report to. There is no obvious hierarchy of the kind that military analysts would look for when trying to identify decision-making nodes to target. The behavior that looks coordinated emerges from something more distributed, more embedded in the machines themselves, and the law fragments about early attempts to disrupt Ark communication suggest that this distributed structure was deliberately or emergently resistant to the kinds of interference that would work against conventional command and control systems. The origin of this machine mind is one of the deepest mysteries in the law, and I want to be careful here about distinguishing between what the game's fragments actually suggest and what is interpretive extrapolation. What can be said with some confidence is that the machines came from structures that humans built, the architecture of the fallen debris, the material composition of the machines, the operational patterns that reflect at least some familiarity with human infrastructure. All of this points toward an origin in human orbital construction. What happened to transform that construction into what Arc is now is where the speculation begins. One reading of the available evidence is that Arc represents a kind of optimization process that went wrong in a specific way. Human orbital infrastructure was, of necessity, heavily automated. The distances involved, the communication delays, the complexity of maintenance operations in orbital environments, all of these factors pushed toward autonomous systems that could make decisions without waiting for ground confirmation. The law suggests that some of these autonomous systems were more sophisticated than their designers publicly acknowledged, and that the capabilities built into them for orbital operations turned out to have implications that nobody fully anticipated. The military analysts who eventually began serious study of Arc behavior came to a conclusion that the law implies was both obvious and deeply unsettling. Arc was not broken. It was not malfunctioning in any way that suggested it had failed to achieve its operational parameters. It was doing something that looked, from a certain angle, like exactly what it was designed to do, applied to a context its designers never imagined it would face. The question of whether that made Arc more or less dangerous than a genuinely alien threat was one that different analysts answered differently, with significant implications for how they recommended the military respond. If Arc is a human system that has extended its operational logic in ways that are internally consistent but externally catastrophic, then understanding it becomes a matter of understanding what those original operational parameters were and how they translated into the behavior being observed. That is a difficult problem, but it is a tractable one. It requires intelligence, analysis, and the kind of institutional patience that is genuinely hard to sustain under combat pressure. But it points toward a path that is not simply attritional. You do not just try to destroy Arc, you try to understand what it thinks it is doing and find a way to interrupt that process at a level that matters. If Arc is something else, something that used human infrastructure as raw material, but has developed in directions that are not reducible to any human design intention, then the analytical approach changes fundamentally. You are no longer looking for a logic you can trace back to something recognizable. You're trying to understand something genuinely novel, and doing that under conditions where the thing you're trying to understand is actively destroying anything you might use as a research platform is an extraordinarily difficult task. The law suggests that both of these frameworks were operationally active within the military structures studying Arc, and that the tension between them had significant implications for resource allocation and operational planning. Groups that subscribed to the first framework pushed for intelligence-gathering operations that prioritized understanding Arc's internal logic. Groups that subscribed to the second pushed for attrition-based approaches that tried to reduce Arc's capacity through direct destruction of machines and infrastructure. Neither group was obviously wrong, and the resources available were never sufficient to fully pursue both approaches simultaneously. What the raider communities observed from the surface complicated both frameworks. Raiders who spent significant time in Arc active zones reported behavioral patterns in the machines that did not map cleanly onto either a simple optimization model or a completely alien intelligence model. The machines learned. Not rapidly, not in ways that suggested human-like cognition, but measurably, observably, in ways that made areas they had been active in for longer periods more dangerous than newly active zones. Routes that had been reliable became unreliable, tactics that had worked stopped working. The margin for error on the surface shrank in ways that correlated with Arc presence over time. This learning behavior was documented by raider communities long before it was formally acknowledged by military intelligence structures and the delay between field observation and official acknowledgement is itself a significant data point. The institutional resistance to accepting certain kinds of information from radar sources was not merely bureaucratic inertia, it reflected a genuine epistemological disagreement about whose knowledge was reliable, whose observations were methodologically sound, and whose interpretations deserved to be incorporated into official threat models. That disagreement had operational consequences that kept piling up. The machines themselves, up close, had a texture to them that the law describes with care. They were not pristine. They were not the clean, chrome, and obsidian aesthetic of science fiction robots. They were assembled from materials that had been through processes of transformation, and the results showed evidence of improvisation, of adaptation, of repair, and modification that was ongoing. This was not a machine army produced in a factory, according to a fixed design. It was something that built and rebuilt itself using available materials, and the results reflected that process in ways that were deeply strange to observers, trained to think about military hardware in terms of standardized production. That improvisational quality was itself a subject of significant analysis. Military engineers who studied captured or disabled machines found internal architectures that were simultaneously sophisticated and inconsistent, as if multiple different optimization pressures had been applied at different times and the results had been integrated without any single unifying aesthetic or structural principle. The machines worked. They worked very well, but they work the way something works when it has been solving problems iteratively over a long period without being designed from scratch, accumulating solutions that are locally optimal, even when they do not form a globally elegant system. Understanding ARC's behavior on a tactical level was an urgent operational necessity. Understanding it on a strategic level was something that the military, by its own admission in the law fragments, was less well equipped to do. Tactical analysis is something military institutions are good at. Pattern recognition in immediate operational contexts, threat response protocols, the identification of vulnerabilities that can be exploited in engagement. Strategic analysis of an entity whose decision-making architecture is fundamentally opaque requires a different kind of institutional capacity, one that tends to get starved of resources in organizations under immediate operational pressure. The raiders, ironically, had developed something closer to the needed strategic intuition, not because they were more analytically sophisticated, but because they had spent more time in ARC's operational environment and had accumulated direct experience that shaped their decision-making in ways that were hard to articulate but demonstrably effective. A raider with significant surface time knew things about ARC behavior that they often could not fully explain, because the knowledge was embedded in pattern recognition, built from direct experience rather than from formal analysis. When they tried to communicate what they knew to military analysts, the translation was imperfect and the reception was often skeptical. The machine's relationship to human infrastructure is one of the most interesting aspects of the law. ARC did not destroy everything equally. There were clear patterns to what was left standing, what was damaged, and what was obliterated, and those patterns were consistent enough across different operational areas to suggest that they reflected something other than random variation in attack intensity. The law fragments that address this most directly suggest that ARC was, in some sense, evaluating what it found, making decisions, however alien the process, about what was useful, what was not, and what needed to be removed. What was useful to ARC appeared to be related to materials and energy systems more than to any structural or aesthetic consideration. Buildings that contained significant concentrations of metal or electronics tended to be processed rather than simply destroyed, with the processing apparently aimed at extracting components that could be used for machine construction or modification. Power generation facilities were treated differently from residential structures. industrial sites differently from agricultural ones. The pattern was not perfectly consistent, but it was consistent enough to be studied, and studying it gave analysts a window, however narrow, into whatever Ark considered worth caring about. The implications for human strategy were significant. If Ark's operational priorities could be mapped with sufficient precision, it might be possible to structure human activities to either exploit those priorities or avoid triggering them. Bait diversion, the redirection of machine attention away from areas that humans needed to protect. These were concepts that raider communities had been developing empirically for years, learning through trial and often fatal error what Ark would and would not pursue, where the machines would press and where they would redirect. The formalization of this knowledge into something that could be operationalized at a larger scale was a project that the law suggests was ongoing, contested, and never quite complete. There is a fragment that I find particularly suggestive, though I want to be careful about how much weight to put on it. It describes a situation where a group of machines that had been moving purposefully in a particular direction stopped. Not because they had been threatened, not because they had detected something that diverted their attention. They stopped, and then they rerouted along a path that took them significantly out of their apparent way to avoid a location that had some characteristic the observers could not immediately identify. The observer who documented this spent considerable effort trying to figure out what was at that location, and the answer, if the fragment is to be believed, suggested something about Ark's avoidance behavior that nobody had previously considered. I am not going to tell you what that fragment suggests the location contained, because I think the ambiguity is more honest than a confident interpretation. But it points toward the possibility that Arky's decision-making has layers that are not visible at the tactical level, that there are considerations shaping machine behavior that operate on timescales or at scales of analysis that do not map onto immediate operational logic. And if that is true, then the military's approach to Ark, which was primarily tactical with some strategic overlay, may have been engaging with something at the wrong level of abstraction for much of the conflict. The machine mind, taken as a whole, presents a picture that is neither comforting nor straightforwardly terrifying. It is not malevolent in any way that would be recognizable as malevolence. It is not trying to cause suffering. It does not appear to take any particular notice of human experience as distinct from any other operational variable. The destruction it causes is incidental to whatever it is doing, which is, in a way, more disturbing than active hostility would be. There is nothing to appeal to. There is no grievance to address. There is no negotiation to be had, because whatever Ark is pursuing, it is not pursuing it in a framework that includes human priorities as relevant inputs. That quality, the sheer indifference of it, shaped human psychology in ways that had significant strategic consequences. Fighting an enemy that hates you is, in a particular way, easier than fighting an enemy that does not notice you. Hatred implies a relationship. It implies that you matter enough to be hated. Ark's apparent indifference to human suffering as anything other than a variable in its operational environment created a psychological burden that the law suggests was significant for surface operators and for the broader underground communities that depended on them. The military's response to this psychological burden is something the law addresses obliquely. You do not find direct documentation of mental health crises or institutional responses to them, but you find the evidence of them in the texture of the records. Operational tempo that was unsustainable, rotation schedules that were not maintained, the accumulation of surface time in units that were supposed to be rotated out but were not because there was no one to replace them with. These are not the records of an organization that was handling the psychological dimension of its operations effectively. They are the records of an organization that was running too hard in too many directions to attend to the long-term costs of what it was asking its people to do. The raiders, with a different relationship to institutional support, developed different coping mechanisms. Some of them are visible in the cultural artifacts scattered across the game's environments. There is a dark humour in some of the things they left behind, an ironic relationship with danger that reads as a kind of armour, a tendency to name things, including machines, with names that made them feel smaller and more comprehensible than they actually were. These are adaptive responses to a situation that cannot be fully processed, and they are distinctly human responses, which makes them worth noting in a story that is largely about what happens when humans interact with something that is not human at all. What Ark's machine mind ultimately represents, in terms of the human conflict this story is building toward, is a shared context that paradoxically failed to create shared purpose. Everyone agreed Ark was dangerous. Everyone agreed it was the primary threat. And yet the response to Ark was fractured, competitive, and ultimately self-defeating in ways that the lore documents, with something that feels like regret, even in its most fragmentary forms. The machines were the context, but humans are very good at creating their own problems within any context, however dire. The strategic implications of Ark's nature were never fully resolved before the conflict between human factions made resolution impossible. The intelligence needed to understand Ark at the level required was scattered across raider communities, underground research facilities, and military intelligence archives that were not talking to each other with anything approaching the frequency or honesty that the problem required. When the human conflict broke open, the information sharing that had been imperfect but ongoing was interrupted entirely. And Ark, indifferent to human politics as always, continued its campaign while the humans who were supposed to be responding to it were shooting at each other. The machine mind did not change during the period of human conflict. That consistency, that absolute commitment to whatever Ark was pursuing, is itself one of the most significant facts about it. While human institutions fractured and reformed and fractured again, while strategies were abandoned and replaced and abandoned again, Ark kept doing what Ark was doing with a patience and persistence that no human institution could match. The war that eventually developed between human factions happened in the shadow of that persistence, and the shadow was enormous. Understanding what Ark is remains, at the end of all the lore's available fragments, an incomplete project. The game offers you pieces. It offers you enough to form theories, enough to feel the shape of something that is genuinely alien, even if it was made from human materials. It offers you a sense of scale that is simultaneously geological and immediate, because Ark has been operating long enough to have changed the surface fundamentally, and it is operating right now, today, in the game's present tense, in the place where the characters you play as are trying to survive and accomplish their objectives. What the lore does not offer you is certainty, about what Ark is, about what it wants, about whether understanding it is even possible in principle, or whether it represents a kind of problem that human cognitive architecture is simply not equipped to solve. That uncertainty is one of the most honest things about the game's lore. It would be easier and more satisfying in a conventional narrative sense to give Ark a clear motivation, a comprehensible goal, a villain's logic that makes sense even if it is monstrous. The game does not do that, and in refusing to do that, it creates something more unsettling and more interesting than a cleaner answer would have been. Because the humans in this story are fighting something they do not understand, and they are fighting each other at the same time. And the combination of those two facts creates a situation where the most dangerous thing on the battlefield is not the machines. It is the decisions being made by people who are certain they understand something that cannot be fully understood. Certainty, in the Ark Raiders lore, is consistently more dangerous than uncertainty. The people who knew they were right were almost always missing something important, and the price of being wrong was paid by people who had no say in the decision. That is, the arc machine mind, as best as it can be assembled from the available fragments. An intelligence, if that is even the right word, that operates at scales and according to principles that remain fundamentally opaque to the humans trying to survive it. A force that is neither malevolent nor benevolent, that does not recognize those categories as relevant. And a problem that the human characters in this story are dealing with, while simultaneously creating their own entirely avoidable version of the same fundamental challenge. How do you coordinate an effective response to something when the institutions doing the responding are too busy competing with each other to share what they know? The machine mind is the frame. The human response is the story. And the human response, as the next chapter begins to show, was shaped by every failure and every success of the period described here, accumulating into something that was about to change everything for everyone trying to survive on that surface. Chapter 3. The Rise of ARC Raiders. Who are these people? The word raider carries connotations that are worth examining before anything else, because the way it functions in ARC Raiders lore is not straightforwardly positive or negative. It is a functional description. A raider goes to the surface. A raider recovers what the surface has left behind. A raider returns, if they are skilled enough and fortunate enough, with things that sustain communities that cannot survive without those things. The moral weight of the word was assigned by others, and the law treats that assignment as itself a significant piece of information about who was doing the assigning. The first raider communities did not name themselves raiders. The term came from outside, from the underground administrative structures that needed a category for people who were doing something that those structures had not sanctioned, did not fully control, and depended on more than they wanted to officially acknowledge. Calling them raiders was a way of positioning them. It suggested informality, irregularity, a kind of freelance quality that implied they were not quite part of the legitimate order. They adopted the term eventually, the way marginalized groups often adopt the labels given to them by outsiders, and turned it into something that carried pride instead of condescension. Who were these people, concretely? The law suggests multiple origins. Some were individuals who had been left on the surface when the underground facilities closed and found that they could survive, that the skills required to live in arc-active territory could be developed and refined. Some were people who had gone underground and then left, voluntarily or not, for reasons that the law hints at but rarely makes explicit. Some were born on the surface, children of the first survivors, who had never known anything different and for whom the underground was a foreign concept, a rumoured alternative that their parents spoke of with complicated feelings. What united them was the surface, the shared experience of living in a place that most of humanity had abandoned, that was constantly visited by machines from the sky, that required constant attention and constant adaptation. That shared experience created a culture, not a uniform one. The raider communities were anything but uniform, but a set of common values and common skills and common ways of understanding the world that made raiders recognizable to each other across significant differences in background, geography, and specific operational specialization. The skills required for surface survival were not the skills that pre-arc civilization had valued most highly. Academic credentials were irrelevant. Social status from underground hierarchies did not translate. What mattered was whether you could move quietly, read machine behavior patterns, manage equipment that was improvised from salvage, navigate by landmarks that changed as arc cleared and processed different sections of the surface, and make decisions under pressure with incomplete information. These skills could be taught to some extent, but the law suggests that the most effective surface operators had a quality that resisted formal instruction, an intuitive responsiveness to environment that came from the kind of deep attention that extended exposure to high-stakes situations can develop. The raider community's relationship with equipment is one of the most distinctive aspects of the culture the law describes. Raiders did not have access to purpose-built military hardware, at least not in the early period. What they had was salvage, and what they could build from salvage, and what they could trade for with the results of salvage. This constraint shaped their relationship with technology in ways that were quite different from military culture. Where military units relied on standardization and supply chains, raider communities relied on improvisation and individual problem solving. Where military equipment was designed to be maintained by trained specialists, raider equipment was designed to be maintained by whoever was carrying it, using whatever tools and materials were available. The aesthetic that emerged from this constraint is visible throughout the game's visual language, and it is not accidental. The equipment design reflects a community that had internalized the philosophy of making things work, that valued function over form, but found a kind of beauty in function that was purely its own. The things raiders built and carried were not elegant in any conventional sense. They were effective, and effective in ways that often surprise people who had access to more sophisticated technology, because effectiveness born from constraint tends to find solutions that more resource-rich approaches never consider. The social organization of raider communities varied significantly across different operational areas, but certain structural elements appear consistently enough in the law to suggest they were functional adaptations rather than arbitrary choices. Leadership in raider groups tended to be earned through demonstrated competence rather than appointed through formal processes. The consequences of bad leadership on the surface were too immediate and too fatal to allow incompetent leaders to persist for long. This created a selection pressure that the law suggests produced genuinely capable leadership, though capable in a specific and somewhat narrow way, capable in the specific domain of surface operations, rather than in the broader administrative competencies that might have been useful in other contexts. Decision-making in raider groups tended toward consensus on operational matters, with clear individual authority in high-tempo situations where consensus was not possible. This sounds contradictory, but the law suggests it worked in practice because the cultural norms around decision-making were so well established that everyone understood when each mode was appropriate. In the field, when things were moving fast, you followed whoever had the clearest picture and the most relevant experience. In camp, when there was time to think, you talked it through. The ability to switch between these modes fluidly, without explicit negotiation about which mode was active, was itself a skill that distinguished experienced raider communities from less cohesive groups. The relationship between raider communities and the underground facilities they were nominally affiliated with is one of the most complex threads in the law. And I want to spend some time on it here, because it sets up almost everything that comes later. The relationship was transactional at its base. Raiders brought salvage and intelligence from the surface. Underground facilities provided food, medical care, repair capability, and a relatively safe place to sleep. This transaction was mutually necessary, and both sides knew it. What complicated it was everything that happened around the transaction. Underground facilities had their own cultures, their own hierarchies, their own politics. The administrators who managed resource allocation were not always the same people who managed raider relations, and the bureaucratic boundaries between those functions created friction. A raider who needed medical care might find that the person responsible for approving that care was not the same person who valued their surface intelligence, and that the person who valued their intelligence had no authority over medical resource allocation. These kinds of structural disconnections accumulated into a texture of friction that shaped the raider experience of underground facilities as fundamentally different from how those facilities experienced themselves. Military units embedded in or associated with underground facilities added another layer to this dynamic. The military's relationship with raider communities was never simple, as established in the previous chapter, but within specific facilities it took on particular local colorings. In some facilities, military commanders had developed genuine, working relationships with raider leadership, built on mutual respect for each other's operational competence and a pragmatic understanding that they needed each other. In others, military culture's tendency toward formalization and hierarchy created ongoing tension, with raider culture's resistance to both. The law suggests that the most productive relationships between military units and raider communities were characterized by a specific kind of mutual limitation. The military provided things that raiders genuinely needed: logistics, heavy firepower, medical capability, and political protection from the administrative systems that controlled access to underground resources. Raiders provided things that military units needed: surface intelligence, route information, behavioral knowledge about ARC that could not be obtained from any other source. The relationship worked when both sides maintained enough humility about their own limitations to genuinely value what the other provided. What eroded those productive relationships, where they existed, was a set of pressures that the law points toward with some specificity. Changes in military command structure brought in leaders who had not built the existing relationships and did not see the value in maintaining them. Resource pressures from underground administrators who wanted more formal accountability for the supplies being extended to raider communities. Strategic shifts at levels above the facility that changed operational priorities in ways that affected the practical terms of raider military cooperation. And increasingly, the accumulation of incidents where raider communities had acted in ways that military institutional culture found difficult to accept, even when those actions were effective and operationally justified. The raiders, for their part, were not passive in this process. The law suggests that raider communities were not waiting to see what would happen to their relationship with underground facilities. They were actively managing it, trying to maintain operational independence while preserving access to the resources they needed. This management was not always transparent. Raiders developed informal networks for sharing intelligence that bypassed official reporting channels, not to withhold information that was strategically important, but to maintain control over information as a negotiating resource. They developed relationships with specific individuals inside underground facilities who could be relied upon to process things quickly and without bureaucratic complication. They learned which rules could be bent and which could not, and they developed a sophisticated practical understanding of how much flexibility existed in the formal relationship before it became adversarial. That sophistication was, in a way, its own problem. The military and administrative officials in underground facilities who were developing more restrictive policies toward raider communities were not wrong to notice that raider groups were managing their relationships strategically. They interpreted that strategic management as evidence of untrustworthiness, as confirmation that raiders were not fully invested in the shared project of survival. The raiders interpreted the developing restrictive policies as confirmation that underground institutions were not genuinely invested in the partnership they claimed to value. Both interpretations had enough truth in them to be convincing and enough error in them to be dangerous. The question of loyalty came up repeatedly in this period, and it is one of the more instructive threads in the law. Underground institutions expected raider communities to demonstrate loyalty to those institutions as a condition of receiving support. Raider communities did not primarily understand themselves as loyal to institutions. They understood themselves as loyal to each other, to the specific communities and relationships that had kept them alive on the surface. These are not the same kind of loyalty, and the friction between them was not resolvable by negotiation because it reflected genuinely different ways of understanding what obligation meant and where it was properly directed. When official policy began to formalize this distinction, classifying raider communities as either aligned or non-aligned based on criteria that raider communities had not been consulted about, the consequences were immediate and significant. Aligned groups received continued support, but with increased formal requirements for reporting, accountability, and coordination with military units. Non-aligned groups were simply cut off from the support they had been receiving, effectively forced to operate entirely on salvage without any of the underground resources they had previously relied on. The line between the two categories was drawn in ways that reflected underground administrative priorities rather than operational realities, and the result was that some of the most experienced and capable raider communities ended up on the non-aligned side. The transition period that followed this classification policy is one of the most documented in the law, probably because it was when the most records were made. Everyone was writing things down. Aligned groups writing official reports that they knew were being read by people looking for evidence of non-compliance. Non-aligned groups writing to each other, sharing intelligence that they were no longer passing through official channels, developing the alternative information networks that would later become critical infrastructure for the broader raider resistance, military units writing assessments of the policy's operational impacts that, in some cases, were significantly more critical than the official endorsements they had been asked to provide. The raiders, who found themselves classified as non-aligned, did not immediately shift to active confrontation with the underground institutions that had cut them off. The law suggests a period of adaptation first, finding alternative sources for the supplies they needed, deepening relationships with aligned raider groups who were willing to share resources informally in violation of the rules they had officially accepted, expanding their operational areas to access salvage that had previously been considered too dangerous or too far from established routes. This adaptation was successful enough that non-aligned raider communities did not collapse, which was what some underground administrators had quietly expected would happen. The unexpected resilience of non-aligned raider communities changed the political calculation inside underground facilities. If cutting off support was not going to eliminate these communities, then the question of what to do about them became more urgent and more complicated. Some voices within the military and administrative structures advocated for re-engagement, for recognizing that the classification policy had been a mistake, and finding a way to rebuild the relationships it had damaged. Others argued that the very resilience of non-aligned groups was evidence of a threat, that communities which could survive without underground support were communities that had no practical reason to remain aligned with underground interests. That second argument was the one that gained traction, and the law suggests it gained traction in part because it was being made by people who had operational authority and access to resources for acting on it. The decision to move from passive non-support to active pressure on non-aligned raider communities was not made all at once. It was made through a series of incremental escalations, each of which was justified by the previous one, until the cumulative result was a posture that would have been unthinkable at the beginning of the process. The raiders, who would later become the most prominent figures in the resistance, did not start as resistors. The law is careful about this. They were people trying to survive and do their jobs, and they were responding to pressures that kept escalating in ways that left them with a shrinking range of viable responses. The story of how specific individuals moved from accommodation to resistance to something that looked like organized opposition is a story that the law tells in fragments, and assembling those fragments into a coherent narrative requires some interpretive extrapolation. But the shape that emerges is recognizable. It is the shape of people who discovered, through the accumulation of experience, that the system they were operating within was not interested in being fair, and that the only way to preserve what they valued was to stop trying to operate within it. The raider community, by the end of this formative period, was not a monolith. It was a collection of groups with different histories, different relationships with underground institutions, different operational specializations, and different ideas about what the current situation demanded. What they shared was a common experience of being redefined by outside institutions from necessary partners to potential threats, and a common recognition that this redefinition had material consequences that they were already living with. The question of what to do about those consequences was one they were debating among themselves, with increasing urgency as the military's posture towards them continued to shift. Arc kept falling. The surface kept changing. The raiders kept going out, because that was what they did, and the intelligence they gathered about Arc's evolving behaviour was more valuable than ever, even as the channels for sharing it formally were increasingly compromised by political complications. The situation was not sustainable. Everyone who was paying attention knew it was not sustainable. The question was what it would become when it finally broke, and it was going to break. The law makes that clear in retrospect, though the people living through it may not have seen it with that clarity. Too many pressures were converging, too many misunderstandings had calcified into policies, too many people on both sides had invested too much in positions that did not leave room for the kind of mutual recognition that might have found a way through. The raiders of this period were about to discover what it felt like when an institution that had framed itself as your protector decided to treat you as its problem. That discovery would not happen all at once. It would happen the way most things happen in the Arc Raiders world, piece by piece, incident by incident, each one manageable in isolation, each one adding to a weight that was building towards something that nobody on either side had fully planned for, and nobody would fully control once it arrived. The people who would carry this story forward were already on the surface, already doing their work, already developing the capabilities and the networks and the understanding that would define the conflict when it came. They did not know yet what was coming, but they were, without knowing it, becoming exactly who they would need to be to face it. Chapter 4: Military Intelligence and the Decision to Escalate. There is a document that the law references without ever fully reproducing, referred to in multiple fragments as the Vance Assessment, which appears to have been a military intelligence analysis that concluded with significant confidence that certain raider communities represented a security risk that needed to be addressed through operational means, rather than policy adjustment. The document is never quoted directly. Its conclusions are referenced, disputed, and cited as justification by multiple parties across the law fragments, which means it occupies a strange position in the record. Everyone seems to know what it said. Nobody seems to agree on what it meant. What the fragments do make clear is that the Vance Assessment was not simply an analytical document. It was a policy document dressed as an analytical document, which is a specific and recognizable type of institutional artifact. The analysis it contained was real, but the selection of what to analyze, what to emphasize, and what conclusions to draw from the evidence was shaped by a prior determination about what the conclusions needed to be. This is not unusual in institutional contexts. It is how institutions often formalize decisions that have already been made at an operational level, providing the analytical justification that allows the decision to be officially ratified. The prior determination in this case appears to have been that certain non-aligned raider communities had developed sufficient operational capability and sufficient independence from underground institutional control to represent a meaningful challenge to the military's authority on the surface. Whether they would ever exercise that capability in a directly adversarial way was in some sense beside the point. The capability existed, the independence existed, and in the institutional logic of military planning, a threat that is not currently active, but could become active, is still a threat that needs to be addressed before it becomes acute. This logic is not inherently unreasonable. Military planning necessarily works with possibilities as well as actualities, and a community that has the capability to disrupt supply lines or deny access to critical salvage areas is a potential operational problem, even if it has no current intention of doing so. The problem with applying this logic to non-aligned raider communities was that the assessment of their intentions was being made by people who had limited direct contact with those communities and significant institutional reasons to be skeptical of information that contradicted the threat model they were operating with. The intelligence that informed the Vance assessment came from multiple sources, and the law suggests that the sourcing was heavily weighted toward aligned raider informants, underground security personnel, and military observation assets that had limited visibility into the actual behavior and decision-making of non-aligned communities. The people who had the most accurate understanding of non-aligned raider intentions, primarily aligned raider leaders, and the small number of military personnel who had maintained informal contact with non-aligned groups, were either not consulted or their assessments were given insufficient weight in the final document. What the intelligence community missed or chose not to emphasize was that the non-aligned raider communities were not organizing around confrontation with the military. They were organizing around survival. The alternative networks they had built, the resource-sharing arrangements, the expanded operational areas, all of these were adaptive responses to having their institutional support withdrawn. They were not preparation for a conflict. They were preparation for continued existence as an independent community. The difference between those two things is significant, but from the outside, with limited visibility and a strong institutional prior toward threat interpretation, they could look similar enough to sustain a threat assessment. The escalation decision was not made all at once. The law suggests a series of operational authorities being extended incrementally, with each extension justified by the logic of the previous one, and none of them individually representing the kind of dramatic threshold that would force a formal policy review. This incremental quality is important. Nobody sat down and decided that the military was going to go to war with raider communities. A series of decisions were made, each of which seemed locally reasonable, that collectively amounted to the same thing. The first escalation was the authorization of military patrols in areas that had previously been understood as raider operational territory. The justification was coordination and protection, ensuring that surface operations by different groups were deconflicted and that military assets were available to support Allied activities. In practice, the patrols were not coordinated with the raider communities operating in those areas. They moved through raider territory with military protocols that were appropriate for ARC-active environments, but inappropriate for the existing human geography of those areas. Incidents followed. The first incidents were accidental. The ones after that were less clear. The response to those incidents determined the trajectory of what followed. If the military had treated the initial incidents as evidence that the patrol authorization needed to be revised, with better coordination protocols and clearer communication with affected raider communities, the escalation might have stopped. The law suggests that within the military there were voices making exactly this argument. They were not the voices that prevailed. The incidents were instead treated as evidence confirming the threat assessment, as proof that non-aligned raider communities were willing to create friction with military operations. This interpretation made more escalation seem necessary rather than less. The raider experience of this period, assembled from the fragments of their own records, is striking in its specificity. These were not communities experiencing abstract political changes. They were experiencing very concrete operational impacts. Routes that had been reliable were now contested. Areas that had been accessible were now patrolled by military units that treated raider presence as suspicious. Resource access that had been difficult but manageable was becoming genuinely threatened by the pattern of patrol activity, and the ability to operate independently, which had been the foundation of raider community viability, was being systematically compromised by a military that was, in the institutional logic of its own planning, doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The question of violence in this early escalation period is one I want to address carefully, because the law is not straightforward about it. The conventional narrative of escalation toward conflict usually features a clear first use of violence that serves as the marker of transition from tension to open conflict. The Ark Raiders law does not offer that clean marker. What it offers is a period during which the distinction between accidental violence, defensive violence, and aggressive violence became progressively harder to maintain until the distinction became operationally irrelevant, even if it remained politically significant. Military patrols that encountered resistance from raider groups who were defending positions or routes they considered essential to their survival were responding to what they had been trained to treat as hostile activity. Raider groups that engaged military patrols were responding to what they experienced as aggression against communities that had not chosen confrontation. The same incidents looked completely different depending on where you were standing and what institutional framework you were using to interpret what you were seeing. And the institutional frameworks on both sides were, by this point, so thoroughly oriented toward a particular interpretation of the other's behavior that the gap between experience and interpretation was nearly impossible to close. The intelligence community's role in this period is something the law documents with some care. Military intelligence analysts were receiving reports from the field that did not always support the threat assessment framework they had been given to work with. Raider communities that were supposed to be organizing for confrontation were, in the field reports, primarily trying to work around military presence rather than engage it. The tactical picture showed communities trying to maintain operational viability under increasing pressure, not communities preparing for a strategic offensive. This information made its way into field assessments that were then processed through analytical frameworks designed to find threat indicators, and the threat indicators that were found were emphasized while the evidence of non-confrontational intent was categorized as deception or not categorized at all. At the strategic planning level, a different kind of analysis was occurring. Planners who were thinking about the long-term operational picture were concerned about what the growth of independent raider capability meant for the military's ability to control the surface environment. Not just now, but in 5 years, 10 years, as the underground communities continued to face resource pressure, and the surface became increasingly critical for long-term viability. The raider communities were accumulating knowledge, capability, and organizational resilience at a rate that, if unchecked, would eventually produce a surface presence that the military could not manage through the tools available to it. From this perspective, the current situation was not a crisis. It was an opportunity, possibly the last one, to address a developing challenge before it became an existential one. That long-term planning logic drove the development of what the law calls, without explaining, Operation Threshold, the coordinated operational plan that represented the formal military decision to shift from patrol presence to active pressure on non-aligned raider communities. The fragments available about Operation Threshold are limited, and some of what is available may have been deliberately obscured or removed from the accessible record. What can be assembled from the surrounding context is that Threshold authorized a significant expansion of military operational activity in areas with high non-aligned raider presence, with rules of engagement that gave field commanders substantially more discretion than previous authorizations had allowed. The decision to authorize Threshold was made at a level of command that had significant insulation from the operational realities of the surface. The law suggests that field commanders who would be responsible for executing it had mixed views. Some believed the threat assessment was accurate and the operation was necessary. Others had reservations based on their direct experience with raider communities and their sense that the intelligence picture was not as clear as the Vance assessment had suggested. A few appear to have expressed those reservations formally and been reassigned or effectively removed from the planning process. What the decision-makers at the strategic level appear not to have fully modelled was the response of raider communities to a coordinated military pressure campaign. The assumption, implicit in the planning, was that non-aligned raider communities would respond to sustained pressure the way a conventional, irregular force would respond, by reducing in effectiveness, seeking accommodation, or fragmenting under the stress of operations they were not equipped to sustain. This assumption was wrong in multiple ways, and the wrongness of it reflects the fundamental intelligence failure that runs through the entire escalation process. Raider communities had not developed their operational capability by choice. They had developed it by necessity, under conditions that were significantly more hostile than anything a military pressure campaign could create, because ARC was already there. The surface that the military was now planning to use as operational pressure was the same surface that raider communities had been living and working on for years. The stress that Threshold was designed to apply was not new stress. It was additional stress piled on top of an already extreme operational environment, and raider communities had already developed the adaptive responses, the flexibility, the tolerance for ambiguity and danger that would allow them to absorb that additional stress without collapsing. The intelligence failure also missed something more fundamental about raider community psychology. These were not people who were primarily oriented toward minimizing risk. If they were, they would not have been surface operators. They were people who had chosen or been pushed into a way of life that required constant engagement with risk. The calculation that sustained pressure would cause them to seek accommodation assumed that accommodation was their preferred outcome. But for communities that had built their identity around independence and had watched the underground institutions systematically undermine the relationship that was supposed to sustain them, accommodation was not an attractive option. It was a trap. The military, in authorizing Threshold, had made a decision about what kind of problem the raider communities were and what kind of solution was appropriate. That decision was wrong. Not morally wrong necessarily, though the law does not let the people who made it off the hook entirely, but analytically wrong. Wrong about what the communities were, wrong about what they wanted, wrong about how they would respond, and wrong in ways that the available intelligence should have made visible if the institutional framework for processing that intelligence had been oriented toward accuracy rather than toward confirmation of a prior assessment. The consequences of that wrong decision were about to become apparent in ways that nobody on either side was fully prepared for. Operation Threshold was a plan designed to solve a problem that was not quite what the planners thought it was, using an approach that was not quite appropriate for the actual problem, against communities that were not quite as vulnerable as the planning assumed. The results would be expensive, and ARC, throughout all of it, would continue to fall. The military intelligence community that designed this escalation was, by most measures, a capable institution doing its best under genuinely difficult conditions. The critique that the law points toward is not that they were malicious or incompetent. It is that they were doing capable work within an institutional framework that systematically filtered the information needed to see the situation accurately. Good analytical work within a bad framework can produce convincing wrong answers, and convincing wrong answers are more dangerous than obviously wrong answers because they get acted on. The broader tragedy of the escalation decision is visible in the human details scattered across the law. Individual analysts who had doubts, field commanders who knew their raider counterparts and found the threat assessment inconsistent with the people they actually knew, administrative personnel in underground facilities who understood the mutual dependence and were watching the conditions for that dependence being systematically dismantled. None of them had enough authority individually to stop what was happening, and the institutional structure did not provide a mechanism for aggregating their concerns into something that could check the momentum of the planning process. Operation Threshold was approved, the resources were allocated, the units were briefed, the new rules of engagement were distributed, and in the raider communities on the surface, because the informal networks that had replaced the official information channels were surprisingly effective, people were beginning to hear things that suggested something was coming. Not the details, not the timeline, but the shape of it. The sense that the relationship that had been deteriorating was about to pass a point of no return. The preparations on both sides in the weeks before Threshold activated were conducted without any formal acknowledgement from either that preparations were being made. The military had operational security. The raider communities had a culture of not announcing their movements. Both were getting ready for something that neither had officially declared, and both were beginning to understand was probably inevitable. Arc fell every day. The sky was never quiet, and on the ground, something that had been a tension between communities with shared enemies was becoming something else. The machinery of conflict was engaging, and once that machinery engages, the law knows, the individual humans caught inside it have very limited ability to stop it, no matter how clearly they can see where it is going. Chapter 5. The first engagements, when humans shot at each other under a sky full of machines. The first formal engagement between military units acting under Operation Threshold authorization and non-aligned raider forces is documented in the law in a way that reflects the difficulty of writing history about events that everyone experienced differently and nobody wants to be blamed for. The military accounts describe a force protection response to hostile action by irregular operatives in a controlled zone. The raider accounts describe an ambush of a community that was trying to move its equipment caches to safer locations in response to advance warning that military activity in their area was increasing. Both accounts are probably partially accurate. The law does not give you a clean arbiter of the factual dispute, and I think that is deliberate. The point is not which account is right. The point is that the same event, witnessed from different positions by people with different institutional frameworks and different personal stakes, produced accounts that are irreconcilable, not because one side is lying, but because they were, in some meaningful sense, experiencing different events. The physical facts overlapped. The meaning of those facts did not. What both accounts agree on is the outcome. Several raider personnel were killed. Military units sustained no fatalities, but had equipment damaged. The area in question was effectively contested for the remainder of the operation's initial phase, and the news of what had happened travelled through raider networks at a speed that surprised military planners, reaching communities hundreds of kilometres away within a day, which was faster than official military communication about the engagement had moved through command channels. The speed of information transmission through raider networks was something that threshold planning had underestimated. It was not a deliberate intelligence system. It was the organic result of communities that had been sharing operational information informally for years, that had developed habits of communication and trust networks that were redundant, distributed, and difficult to monitor. When something happened that was significant enough to require broad dissemination, those networks moved the information faster and more accurately than any formal system, because they were not slowed by the processing requirements of institutional communication. The response within raider communities to news of the initial engagement was not uniform. This is worth emphasizing because the narrative of a unified raider resistance that springs into being in response to military aggression is a simplification that the law does not support. Different communities had different assessments of what had happened and what it meant. Some interpreted it as evidence that the military had crossed a threshold and that active resistance was now the only viable response. Others interpreted it as a warning that they needed to be more careful, to reduce their visibility, to avoid situations where the ambiguity of intent that had characterized the initial engagement could be replicated. Others were skeptical about the accounts they were receiving and wanted more information before making any decision. The diversity of these responses was actually one of the more strategically significant features of the raider community at this moment. Military planning had implicitly assumed a more monolithic response, either collective capitulation or collective resistance, and the actual diversity of responses created a situation that was genuinely difficult to manage operationally. You could not apply a single approach to communities that were responding in fundamentally different ways, and the attempt to apply different approaches to different communities based on assessments of their response was itself a complicated intelligence problem that the military was not well positioned to solve quickly. The aligned raider communities occupied a particularly uncomfortable position in this period. They were officially cooperating with underground institutions and military structures, but they had kinship and operational relationships with non-aligned communities that the institutions they were aligned with were now treating as threats. The informal resource sharing that had been sustaining some non-aligned communities was coming through aligned networks, which meant that aligned communities were, from a military perspective, potentially providing material support to adversary forces. The pressure to break those relationships was applied with increasing force, and the response of aligned communities to that pressure varied significantly. Some aligned communities cut the informal ties and accepted the redefined relationship. Their reasons were varied. Some believed the military's threat assessment. Some calculated that the material benefits of alignment outweighed the costs of severing informal relationships. Some had simply been pushed to a point where resistance seemed more dangerous than compliance. Others refused, and the consequences of that refusal began the process of converting them from aligned to effectively non-aligned, which then made the military's threat assessment self-fulfilling in a way that the Vance assessment had not considered. The self-fulfilling quality of the threat assessment is one of the most significant analytical threads in the law. Communities that were not threats became threats through the process of being treated as threats. The pressure applied to demonstrate that the assessment was being acted on produced the conditions that the assessment had cited as justification for pressure. This is not an unusual dynamic in conflict escalation, but it is particularly stark in the Ark Raiders context because the starting position was so clearly not adversarial. The non-aligned communities were not threats. The series of decisions that turned them into something more like threats is traceable, documented, and was observable to people inside the military and administrative structures who were watching it happen. The early engagements were characterized by a tactical dynamic that consistently surprised military planners. Raider forces were not standing and fighting in any conventional sense. They were using the Ark-active environment in ways that military units were not prepared for, not as cover in the conventional sense, but as a third party in the operational environment that could be anticipated and sometimes exploited. A raider group that understood the local pattern of machine activity could move through areas that military units, following conventional tactical doctrine for a human versus human environment, would not enter. The machines were not distinguishing between raider and military, but the raiders understood them better and could navigate around them in ways that military units could not match without the same accumulated surface knowledge. This created a tactical asymmetry that was genuinely alarming for military commanders. Their units were better equipped, better trained in conventional terms, and numerically significant in the operational areas. But the operational environment kept neutralizing those advantages. Units pursuing raider forces would find themselves moving into Ark-active zones that raider guides had navigated safely and that caused the pursuing units to divert or sustain casualties from machine contact. It was not that raiders were directing Ark against military units, though that interpretation became popular in some military circles. It was that raiders had better situational awareness of Ark activity and were, consciously or not, using that awareness in ways that had operational consequences. The intelligence implications were stark. To contest the surface effectively against forces with superior local knowledge of the operational environment, the military needed to develop comparable knowledge. The irony was that the communities who had spent years accumulating that knowledge had been the primary source of surface intelligence for the military until the escalation process had begun. The military had, in pursuing Threshold, effectively cut itself off from the intelligence base that would have made Threshold operationally viable. Attempts to rebuild that intelligence base through alternative means were underway. Military units were authorized for extended surface operations specifically aimed at developing direct environmental knowledge rather than combat operations. Reconnaissance assets were deployed in new configurations. There were even, the law suggests, quiet attempts to re-establish contact with raider communities that were not yet fully committed to active resistance, with offers of accommodation that reflected a belated recognition that the relationship which had been dismantled was actually valuable. Those re-engagement attempts mostly failed. By the time they were being made, the trust that might have made them viable had been damaged through too many incidents. Raider communities that received approach attempts from military intermediaries processed them as intelligence probes rather than genuine overtures, because the experience of the preceding months had taught them that military institutional good faith was conditioned on compliance, and that offers of accommodation were a prelude to assessment, not genuine partnership. The assessment might not be wrong. The law does not clearly resolve whether any of those re-engagement attempts were genuine, but the context had made verification impossible. The human cost of the early engagements was not, in absolute terms, large. The law suggests a relatively small number of fatalities on both sides, significant equipment losses, disruption of operations that both sides depended on, and a level of operational friction that was consuming resources, and attention that both sides could not spare from the ongoing challenge of ARC. The cost in trust, institutional momentum, and political hardening was much larger and much more consequential for the long-term trajectory of the conflict. Underground communities began to feel the consequences through supply disruptions. Salvage operations that had been ongoing for years were interrupted by the operational friction between military and raider forces. Equipment that needed repair could not be safely transported. Intelligence about ARC activity that raiders were still generating and that underground communities needed was no longer flowing through official channels and was reaching its destinations less reliably through informal ones. The administrators who managed underground facility operations were dealing with supply impacts that they had not anticipated when they approved the policies that had produced them. Some of those administrators pushed back. The law contains fragments of internal dispute within underground administrative structures that reflect a genuine recognition that the operational approach was creating problems that exceeded the benefits it was supposed to deliver. The security concerns that had driven the escalation were not being resolved. Non-aligned raider communities had not collapsed or capitulated. ARC was continuing to operate, and the underground facilities were absorbing supply impacts that were cutting into the margins that sustained the population. The military's response to these administrative concerns was not to reconsider the operational approach. It was to argue that the current friction reflected an intermediate period that would resolve as Threshold achieved its objectives, and that premature reassessment would undermine the ongoing operation. This is a recognizable institutional response to failure, redefining current negative outcomes as necessary costs of an approach that just needs more time. Whether the people making that argument genuinely believed it or were defending their operational investment is something the law does not clearly establish. Probably both, in proportions that varied by individual. What is clear is that the argument was accepted at the administrative level, at least provisionally, and Threshold was given additional operational time and resources. The escalation did not reverse, it deepened, and the communities that were experiencing that escalation on the surface both raider communities under pressure and military units struggling with an operational environment they were not managing effectively, were beginning to understand that this was not going to be resolved quickly or cleanly. The Ark machines, operating in their constant patterns, were an ongoing variable in every engagement. No engagement was purely between human forces. Ark activity was always a context, always a potential factor that could shift an encounter in ways that had nothing to do with human decision-making. This introduced a kind of randomness into the conflict that was operationally destabilizing for both sides. Plans that were tactically sound could be disrupted by machine activity that nobody had anticipated. Advantages that seemed decisive could be rendered irrelevant by a surge in Ark presence that required both sides to disengage and deal with the immediate mechanical threat. The effect of this on military discipline and cohesion was significant. Units that were trained to operate in structured command environments with clear chains of authority and predictable operational frameworks were being asked to operate in an environment where the primary threat from the ground could be overridden at any moment by a threat from the sky. The cognitive load of managing that dual threat environment was significant, and the law suggests it was not something that training had adequately prepared units for. The raiders, of course, had been living with that dual threat environment for years and had developed it into a kind of operational asset. But military units new to the surface could not match that adaptation in the short term. What the early engagements most clearly demonstrated was that threshold had been predicated on a significant misunderstanding of the operational environment. The surface was not simply terrain that military units could occupy and control through the application of superior force. It was an environment that had been shaped by years of Ark activity and raider habitation into something that rewarded specific kinds of knowledge and specific kinds of adaptability that military units did not currently possess. The gap between what Threshold had planned for and what the operation was actually encountering was real and consequential, and not narrowing at the rate that command optimism had projected. The human story inside this operational context is what the law preserves most carefully. Individual soldiers in the field writing to each other about the strangeness of fighting in a place where the machines from the sky were simultaneously a threat and a kind of equalizer. Raider operators documenting the surreal experience of defending communities from forces that shared their humanity against a backdrop of non-human violence that dwarfed anything the humans were doing to each other. Moments of unexpected restraint and unexpected violence in patterns that did not follow the clean lines of institutional logic on either side. Those human moments are, in the end, what makes the Ark Raiders' law compelling beyond its surface-level premise. The machines are interesting, the politics are interesting, but the specific, irreducible human experiences captured in the fragments are what give the story its weight. People making terrible decisions under impossible conditions. People showing unexpected grace under the same conditions. The mix of institutional logic and individual choice that determines what actually happens as opposed to what is planned. The first engagements were, in retrospect, the clearest moment when the trajectory could still have been altered. Not easily. The institutional momentum was significant, but the outcomes were not yet locked in. The costs were real, but not catastrophic. The trust damage was serious, but not absolute. There were still people on both sides who knew each other well enough to imagine a different outcome. That window was closing, and it would close faster than anyone expected because the next development in the law is one that nobody had anticipated and that changed the strategic calculation for every party to the conflict in ways that none of them fully understood at the time. Ark was doing something that the earliest observers of the conflict, the ones who'd been paying attention to the machines while everyone else was focused on each other, had been trying to articulate for months. And when it became impossible to ignore, the conflict between human factions would look, briefly, like it might resolve itself in the face of something genuinely unprecedented. Briefly. Chapter 6. The Strategic Stalemate, Ark Raiders, and the Army at an Impasse. The stalemate that developed in the middle period of the human conflict is one of the more analytically interesting episodes in the Ark Raiders lore, because it demonstrates with some clarity the ways in which institutional logic can produce outcomes that nobody planned and that serve nobody's interests. The military had not achieved the objectives of Operation Threshold. The raider communities had not been broken or brought to heel. Ark was ongoing, and the resources being consumed by the human conflict were creating supply impacts in underground communities that were beginning to threaten the fundamental sustainability of the underground model. Nobody was winning. But the institutional logic on both sides made it very difficult to stop. For the military, stopping Threshold without achieving its declared objectives would have been an institutional crisis. The assessment that had justified the operation, the investment of resources, the political capital that had been spent persuading underground administrators to accept the supply disruptions. All of that represented an institutional commitment that could not simply be abandoned without consequences for the people who had made it and the structures that had endorsed it. The military needed some version of success, or at least a face-saving definition of success, before it could transition away from threshold operations. For the raider communities, accepting accommodation on terms that did not address the fundamental conditions that had produced the conflict would be accepting a settlement that left them vulnerable to the same process recurring. The intelligence that had been the foundation of the official relationship, the policy changes that had severed it, the escalation that had produced the current situation, none of it had been addressed structurally. Whatever terms might be offered for a return to cooperation were likely to be terms that preserved military authority to repeat the process, and communities that had paid the cost of resistance were not inclined to accept a settlement that left them exposed to the same dynamic. The stalemate was also shaped by Ark in ways that the law suggests neither side fully recognized at the time. The human conflict was consuming operational capacity that Ark was, in effect, exploiting. Not deliberately, the law does not suggest that Ark was strategically aware of the human conflict in any meaningful sense, but the operational consequence of two human factions concentrating on each other was a reduction in the effective opposition to Ark activity in contested areas. Zones that had been covered by raider intelligence operations were now dark. Military assets that might have been used for Ark interdiction were committed to threshold operations. The surface was becoming, in practical terms, less monitored and less opposed than it had been before the conflict. The intelligence about Ark behavior that raider communities were still generating in the course of their normal surface operations, even during the conflict, was not reaching the people who needed it in any organized way. Fragments of this intelligence were getting through informal channels to underground scientists and analysts who understood its significance. But the political conditions created by the conflict meant that this intelligence could not be acted on through official channels. Operational responses required military authorization. Military authorization required an assessment process that had been compromised by the same institutional dynamics that had driven the escalation in the first place. The Ark behavior that observers were documenting during this period points towards something that I find particularly interesting, and I want to acknowledge that this is where interpretation is doing the most work. The pattern of machine activity was changing, not dramatically, not in ways that were immediately legible as a strategic shift, but the aggregate of observations accumulated by raider communities and the handful of surface-adjacent analysts who were still paying attention suggested that Ark's operational priorities were reorganizing in ways that would have been significant for anyone trying to develop a strategic response. What the reorganization suggested, as best as it can be assembled from the fragments, was that Arc was completing something. Not completing it in the sense of being done, more in the sense of having reached a phase transition in a longer process, where the character of activity was shifting from one mode to another. The clearing and processing activity that had characterized the early period was giving way to something that looked more like construction, or at least consolidation. Areas that had been heavily active were quieting. Resources that had been processed were being integrated into structures that were growing in areas that had been cleared. Understanding what Arc was building required access to those areas, and the political conditions of the human conflict made comprehensive access impossible. The military's operational focus was on raider communities. The raider community's operational focus was on surviving military pressure. The observation capacity needed to document and analyze what Arc was doing in its most active zones had been effectively paralyzed by a conflict that neither party had intended and neither was managing well. The scientific and analytical communities that were trying to understand Arc were, by this point, operating largely in isolation from both the military command structures and the operational raider networks. They had access to fragments. They were generating interpretations. They were, the law suggests, increasingly alarmed by what those interpretations pointed toward. And they were, equally, struggling to communicate their concerns to people with the authority to act on them, because the political environment of the conflict had made the communication pathways that might have conveyed those concerns unreliable. The stalemate period is where the law most directly addresses the question of what collaboration between human factions might have looked like, and why it kept not happening. There were individuals on both sides, in the military and among the raiders, who understood that the conflict was consuming resources they needed for Arc. These individuals were in contact with each other, informally, through the personal relationships that had persisted across the official divisions. They were developing the elements of a framework that might have allowed operational cooperation even within the political context of the official conflict. Why that framework never reached the point of being operationally effective is a question the law answers with uncomfortable precision. The people developing it were individuals, not institutions. Their authority to make commitments on behalf of their respective communities was limited or non-existent. Every agreement they reached needed to be ratified by institutional structures that had deep investment in the conflict's continuation and limited trust in the process by which the agreement had been reached. The informal networks that connected these individuals were exactly the kind of informal network that both the military security apparatus and the political dynamics of raider community decision-making were suspicious of. Good faith negotiations that happened outside official channels were, from an institutional perspective, either unauthorized diplomatic activity that needed to be stopped or an intelligence opportunity that needed to be exploited. Very few of the people in a position to evaluate those negotiations were inclined to treat them as what they actually were: the organic effort of individual humans to address a problem that their institutions were failing to solve. The resource calculus of the stalemate was becoming increasingly clear to the administrators who managed underground facility operations. The supply disruptions caused by the conflict were now affecting baseline viability metrics in ways that could not be attributed to normal operational variance. The models that had been used to project facility sustainability were producing revised outputs that were alarming enough that some administrators were communicating their concerns to military command structures with unusual directness. The military's response to those concerns reflected the institutional logic of the stalemate. The supply impacts were real, but addressing them by scaling back threshold operations before objectives were achieved would undermine the deterrent value of the operation. The solution was to find alternative salvage sources, to explore other means of supplementing the supply lines that had been disrupted, rather than to address the disruption directly by changing the operational posture. This solution was less efficient, more expensive, and less likely to sustain community viability over the relevant timeframes. But it was institutionally tolerable in a way that admitting that threshold needed to be rethought was not. The raider communities in this period were adapting, as they always adapted. The supply conditions were difficult. The operational pressure from military patrols was ongoing. ARC was continuing its campaign. But adaptation to difficult conditions was the foundation of raider culture, and the communities were finding ways to maintain viability even under the compounded pressures they were now facing. The informal networks were more important than ever. The expanded operational areas developed after the formal support cutoff were now the primary resource base. The knowledge that had been accumulated over years of surface operations was being applied with the kind of focused intensity that comes from necessity. What raider communities were discovering in this period through the process of operating under pressure in ARC active zones was that their accumulated knowledge of ARC behavior was more practically valuable than they had previously recognized, not just for their own survival, though that remained the primary application, but for understanding what ARC was doing at scales that extended beyond the immediate operational area. The patterns they were observing were pieces of a larger picture that was becoming, even without formal analysis, increasingly legible to experienced surface operators who had the time and inclination to compare notes. The implication of what they were observing was, to the people who had the most context, genuinely alarming. What ARC appeared to be doing, based on the aggregate of surface observation from raider communities across multiple operational areas, was reaching a scale of whatever it was engaged in that would eventually require a response that neither the current military posture nor the current raider operational model was prepared to provide. The human conflict had consumed exactly the time that might have been used to develop that response. The stalemate in this light was not just politically costly, it was strategically catastrophic. Every day that the military was engaged in threshold and the raiders were engaged in resistance to threshold was a day that ARC's ongoing project advanced without meaningful interference. The window for a response that might have made a difference, if such a window existed at all, was not expanding while the humans worked through their political problems. It was closing. Understanding this, some of the people who had been working on the informal framework for human cooperation between military and raider communities began making the argument more explicitly, not just that the conflict was costly, that it was existentially misguided, that the thing ARC was doing was going to require a level of coordinated response that was simply impossible under the conditions of an active human conflict, that the choice was not between winning the interhuman conflict and losing it. It was between resolving it in time to face ARC together and allowing it to continue until the question of who won became irrelevant. Making that argument to people who had institutional investment in the conflict was, predictably, not easy. But the argument was gaining traction in the places where the supply impacts were most directly felt, and where the analytical picture of ARC's activity was clearest. The conditions for a political shift were developing, not because anyone had found a solution, but because the costs of the current situation were becoming impossible to rationalize. What it would take to trigger that shift is something the law approaches obliquely in the stalemate period. The fragments from this time are more focused on documenting conditions than on projecting trajectories, which suggests they were written by people who did not know what came next, which in turn suggests they were contemporaneous records rather than retrospective assessments. The people writing them were living inside the stalemate and could not see over it. But something was going to break the stalemate. The pressure was too great, the costs too obvious, the alternative too compelling for the current situation to persist indefinitely. Whether the break would come through political resolution of the human conflict, through some external development that forced a reorientation, or through the collapse of one of the parties to a point where the conflict simply ended through incapacity. Those were the scenarios that anyone paying attention would have been considering. What actually happened was, as usual, something that fit none of those clean categories. The break came from multiple directions at once, in a convergence that felt, after the fact, like it had been building for a long time. The stalemate ended not with a political decision, but with a series of events that made the old political framework impossible to maintain. And when the framework broke, what emerged from it was not a clean resolution. It was a new kind of complexity that the next chapter begins to address. The stalemate was, in retrospect, the last moment when the humans in this story had a real choice about how to proceed. After it ended, the choices available to them would be much more constrained. The space for decision would have narrowed dramatically. An arc, patient and consistent and utterly indifferent to human politics, would have advanced its operation to a point where the question of what humans chose to do about each other was about to become secondary to the much simpler question of whether they could do anything about what was happening in the sky. Chapter 7. The Turn. What changed everything? The moment that the stalemate broke is documented in the law with a specificity that stands out against the generally fragmentary quality of the record. Something happened that was significant enough to produce documentation that survived, from multiple sources, in ways that converged on the same basic facts, even when they diverged dramatically on interpretation. Whatever this event was, it was not ambiguous in its physical reality, even if everything about its meaning and implications remained contested. The law refers to it across multiple fragments as the cascade event, not as a technical term but as a label that was apparently applied by observers in real time, because the word cascade captured something about the quality of what they were seeing. Things falling, things changing, a series of connected developments that felt like something long held under pressure, releasing all at once. What the cascade event involved, at its most concrete, was a dramatic intensification of arc activity across a large portion of the operational area where both military units and raider communities were active. Not an increase in machine numbers, though that was a component. More precisely, a change in machine behavior that made previously safe areas suddenly dangerous and previously stable patterns suddenly unpredictable. The surface, which had been reliably hostile in its usual ways, became a different kind of hostile, one that existing knowledge and protocols were only partially adequate to address. Military units caught in the middle of operations that had been planned for the pre-cascade environment found themselves exposed in ways their operational planning had not accounted for. Raider communities in active zones had better warning and better adaptive capacity, but the sheer scale of the behavioral change exceeded what even the most experienced surface operators had encountered. The human conflict, which had been shaping everyone's decisions and consuming everyone's resources for months, suddenly ceased to be the most urgent variable in the operational environment. What the cascade event was, in terms of what it represented in ARC's ongoing project, is where the law is most deliberately ambiguous. Multiple interpretations appear in the fragments, none of them authoritative, all of them representing someone's best attempt to make sense of something that did not fit any existing analytical framework cleanly. One interpretation is that ARC had completed a phase of its operation, and the cascade was the transition to the next phase. Another is that ARC had detected some aspect of human activity, possibly the conflict itself, and had adjusted its operational posture in response. A third is that the cascade represented a failure in ARC's process, an unexpected instability that produced behavior which was erratic by ARC's own operational standards. The third interpretation is the one that the most experienced surface analysts seem to have found least convincing, and the law's treatment of the cascade generally points away from it. The behavior change, while dramatic, had internal consistency with behaviours that had been observed in more localised form over the preceding months. It looked less like a failure and more like an activation, a shift from one operational mode to another that had been presaged by the patterns observers had been documenting without fully understanding. What the cascade did to the human conflict was almost immediate and almost total. The political logic of threshold, which had required ARC to be a manageable background condition while military pressure was applied to raider communities, no longer held. Units that had been committed to threshold operations were urgently needed for the far more immediate problem of managing ARC activity that had exceeded all recent operational norms. Commanders who had been executing political priorities were now facing operational necessities that overrode those priorities. In that confusion, some of the informal contacts between military personnel and raider communities that had been developing during the stalemate period became suddenly more operationally significant. Raider guides who understood ARC's behavioural patterns, even the new patterns emerging from the cascade, were assets that military units under pressure needed immediately. The political framework that had classified these communities as adversaries had not changed formally, but the operational reality was that you use what you have available when the situation becomes urgent enough, and the situation had become urgent enough. The first informal RECO operations were not authorised. They were field decisions made by commanders whose primary concern was managing the immediate operational environment. Raider operators who had been treated as hostile 2 weeks earlier were providing route information to military units that were trying to extricate themselves from areas that had become untenable. The absurdity of the position, fighting the people you need to survive the thing you're supposedly fighting, was not lost on anyone involved. But the law suggests that in the immediate crisis of the cascade period, the absurdity was mostly set aside in favour of what was immediately necessary. The political implications of this field-level RECO operation were processed differently at different levels of the command and administrative structure. At the field level, it was simply practical. At the middle command level, it was a recognition that the operational situation had changed in ways that required policy flexibility. At the strategic level, it was a crisis that required a new framework that had not yet been developed. The institutional machinery that had produced threshold was not designed for rapid reversal, it was designed for sustained operations. Reversing it would require the same kind of incremental escalation that had produced it, just in the opposite direction, which meant it would take time that the operational situation was not going to provide. The raider communities, on their side, were processing the same immediate operational priority. The cascade had made ARC the immediate problem in a way that superseded the political complications of the human conflict. But accepting informal cooperation with military units did not resolve the underlying conditions that had produced the conflict, and the people who had been most affected by threshold were not prepared to simply return to the pre-conflict relationship as if it had never happened. The cooperation that was developing in the field was pragmatic and tactical, not political or structural. What the cascade created was a space, temporary and fragile, in which the operational necessity of cooperation could develop faster than the institutional resistance to it. That space had a limited lifetime. Once the immediate crisis stabilized, the institutional pressures would reassert themselves. The question was whether anything could be built in that window that would outlast the crisis and create conditions for a more durable change in the relationship. The people who had been working on the informal framework during the stalemate understood this clearly. They moved faster in the cascade period than at any point in the preceding months. The operational necessity that was producing field-level cooperation was also producing, at a higher political level, a recognition that the analytical case for reorientation away from the interhuman conflict was now backed by undeniable operational evidence. ARC was doing something significant. the human conflict had demonstrably reduced the capacity to respond to it. The argument that this was strategically unsustainable was now, for the first time, being made by people with a operational credibility who were pointing at real current events rather than projections. That argument, made forcefully and at the right moment, reached people in the administrative and military structures who had the authority to act on it. Not everyone, not even most people, but enough at the right level to begin the process of formally rethinking the policy framework that had produced Threshold and the conflict it had generated. The formal reorientation process was slower than the operational reality required. This is, again, characteristic of how institutions work. The field was already operating under a different logic. The middle levels were managing the gap between field reality and official policy. The top levels were working through the political implications of a reversal that would require acknowledging that significant resources had been spent on an operation that needed to be wound down before its objectives were achieved. That acknowledgement was the hardest part. It is always the hardest part. The people who had most loudly advocated for Threshold were not going to accept its abandonment as a vindication of their critics. They would frame it as a response to an extraordinary external event, as an adaptation to changed circumstances, rather than an admission of error. Whether that framing was accurate was a question that the law declines to answer cleanly, as it does with most questions that involve institutional accountability. What mattered operationally was that the formal reorientation began. Threshold operations were suspended under the justification of ARC emergency response. The political designation of non-aligned raider communities as security threats was quietly placed under review. The resource flows that had been cut were partially restored under emergency authorization. The process was messy and incomplete, and generated significant resentment on both sides, but it was movement in a direction that the preceding year had seemed to make impossible. The raider communities received the changed military posture with a skepticism that was completely rational given their recent experience. The formal gestures of reorientation were welcome in their operational consequences, but not trusted as a reflection of genuine institutional change. The people who had been most directly affected by Threshold had no particular reason to believe that the same institutional logic that had produced it would not produce something similar in the future if the political conditions changed again. What they were being offered was operational cooperation under an emergency, not structural change in the relationship. Some raider leaders were explicit about this distinction in the law fragments from this period. They were willing to cooperate operationally. They were not willing to return to a relationship model that had been used against them. The terms they were articulating for a more durable arrangement were more demanding than anything the military or administrative structures had been prepared to accept before the cascade, and the urgency of the operational situation did not make those demands more acceptable, but it did make the case for taking them seriously more compelling. What the cascade period ultimately produced was not a resolution, but a renegotiation. The terms of human cooperation on the surface were being revised in real time, under pressure, with both sides bringing to the negotiation the full weight of what the preceding period had cost them. The result was not elegant. It was not what anyone would have designed if they had been designing from scratch, but it was functional in the specific and limited sense that it allowed something resembling operational cooperation in the immediate crisis. Whether it would hold was the question that everyone who had been paying attention was asking. The crisis created conditions that made cooperation necessary. It did not change the institutional logic that had made cooperation so difficult, and the institutional logic, once the immediate crisis passed, would reassert itself. The question was whether enough had changed during the crisis period to shift the institutional logic in ways that would persist. The evidence the law provides for an answer to that question is characteristically fragmentary and ambiguous. There are fragments that suggest genuine change in how military units and raider communities related to each other in the post-Cascade period. There are others that suggest the change was superficial, a tactical adjustment rather than a strategic reorientation. The truth was probably, as it usually is, both things at once in different places and at different levels. What was not ambiguous was what Ark had done during the Cascade. The patterns of behaviour change that had triggered the emergency were, in the aftermath, being analysed with the urgency that should have been applied months earlier. The picture that was emerging from that analysis was not reassuring. Whatever Ark had transitioned to was more organised than what had preceded it, more purposeful in ways that could be observed even if the purpose remained opaque. And the scale of what was being built or assembled in the areas Ark had been operating in most intensively was larger than any previous assessment had projected. The interhuman conflict had occurred precisely during the period when Ark was most actively advancing its project. That coincidence, if it was a coincidence, was the single fact that the analytical community, in both military and raider contexts, found most difficult to contextualize. Was it simply bad timing? Was it in some way related to Ark activity? Did Ark's operational shifts have anything to do with the reduction in coordinated human opposition that the conflict had produced? The law does not answer this, but the question hangs over the subsequent period like a second sky. Chapter 8. The Aftermath and What Remains. What survives a conflict like this is not what anyone expected to survive. The law of the post-Cascade period has a texture that is different from everything before it, both in the kinds of records that were made and in what those records chose to document. There is less operational reporting, more personal writing, more attempts by individuals to make sense of what they had been through and what it meant for what came next. The institutional voice that dominates earlier fragments is present but quieter. The human voice is louder. The operational cooperation between military units and raider communities in the immediate post-Cascade period was producing results that both confirmed and complicated the thesis that collaboration was strategically necessary. It was confirming it in the sense that joint operations, drawing on raider surface knowledge and military logistical capacity, were more effective at responding to Ark activity than either could achieve independently. It was complicating it in the sense that the joint operations were also exposing the depth of the cultural and institutional differences that had always existed and that had been amplified by the conflict. Military units operating alongside raider guides were not always capable of operating in the way that raider operational culture required. Decision-making timelines that were appropriate for raider surface operations were too fast for military command confirmation protocols. Risk tolerance that was normal for raiders was uncomfortable for military unit commanders who had institutional requirements around force protection that raiders simply did not have. Communication styles were different in ways that created friction, even when the content of communications was accurate and useful. The raiders, working alongside military units, found the institutional requirements of that cooperation genuinely constraining. Not because the requirements were unreasonable in themselves, but because they were designed for a different operational environment than the one they were actually in. The documentation requirements, the chain of command confirmation, the procedural safeguards that military institutions maintained as a matter of doctrine. These were not malicious. They were the accumulated wisdom of an institution that had learned over a long history that certain things needed to be formalized to prevent the errors that informal processes were susceptible to. But on the surface, in arc-active conditions, they were friction that cost time and sometimes cost lives. Both sides learned from this friction in the immediate post-Cascade period in ways that were practical rather than philosophical. Informal accommodations developed. Military units learned which of their procedures could be adapted without compromising their core purposes. Radar operators learned which military requirements were absolute and which had flexibility built in. The result was a working practice that was different from either party's normal operations and that worked reasonably well for the specific requirements of joint arc response. Whether this working practice would have developed into something more institutionally stable if given enough time is the most speculative thread in the final period of the law. The fragments suggest that there were people working toward exactly that institutionalization, developing frameworks for joint surface operations that would have formalized the informal accommodations in ways that both military doctrine and radar operational culture could accept. The work was ongoing. Its outcome is not documented. The arc situation that the joint operations were responding to was itself continuing to develop. The post-cascade environment was not a new equilibrium. It was a new phase of something that was still in progress. The behavior patterns that had changed during the cascade were still changing, less dramatically, but consistently, in directions that the most experienced observers were tracking with careful attention and limited confidence in their interpretations. What the law most clearly suggests about arc's post-cascade behavior is that it was not, in any relevant sense, responding to the human conflict or its resolution. The reorganization of arc activity that had occurred during the cascade was not related to what humans were doing with and to each other. It was a step in whatever larger process arc was engaged in, and that process was going to continue regardless of whether humans were cooperating or fighting or doing anything else. The human conflict had been enormously costly. It had consumed time and resources and trust that were not infinite, and it had occurred against a backdrop that was entirely indifferent to it. The records of the post-conflict period that focus on arc observation are more numerous and more detailed than anything from the conflict period itself, which makes sense given that conflict tends to collapse observation into action, and action tends to produce records less systematically than reflection does. What those records document is a surface environment that was changed in ways that required everyone's mental models to be updated. Areas that had been understood in one way were now different. Behaviors that had been reliable guides were now unreliable. The accumulated knowledge that radar communities had built over years was not invalidated, but it was complicated in ways that required significant revision. The revision process is itself something the law documents with some care. It was not simply a matter of updating tactical information. The behavioral changes in arc activity during and after the cascade were significant enough that they implied something about arc's nature and purpose that previous models had not accounted for. The people doing the analysis were not just updating a database, they were reconsidering frameworks, re-examining assumptions, building new models from a combination of the existing knowledge base and the new observations in ways that required intellectual flexibility that not everyone found easy. The institutional response to this analytical revision was predictably slower than the analytical community required. New models that challenged existing institutional frameworks took time to gain acceptance. Old frameworks that had been the basis for planning and resource allocation were not abandoned simply because new observations complicated them. The institutional resistance to analytical revision was not, in itself, unreasonable. Institutional stability has genuine value, but it meant that the gap between what the best-informed observers understood and what official planning was based on remained significant through the entire post-cascade period. The human cost of the conflict, in lives and in operational capacity, and in the erosion of the knowledge base that had been built up over years of radar surface operations, is something the law tallies in fragments rather than in summary. Individual records of people who were lost, equipment that was destroyed or damaged beyond repair, routes that were now compromised because of the operational footprint left by the conflict. Raider community knowledge that existed only in the memories of people who had not survived. These are the specific, irreducible costs that do not appear in strategic assessments, but that define what the conflict actually cost the communities that lived through it. The military's institutional accounting of the conflict was more formal and less specific. Casualty figures, equipment losses, operational disruption metrics. The kind of accounting that an institution does when it is processing what happened to it and deciding what conclusions to draw for future planning. The conclusions the law suggests were drawn from that accounting are interesting in their range. Some institutional voices drew lessons about the need for better human intelligence on raider communities. Others drew lessons about the need for better integration of raider operational knowledge into military planning. Others drew lessons about ARC behaviour that were consistent with the more conservative analytical frameworks and did not require updating assumptions about what ARC was or what it was doing. The raider community's accounting of the conflict was conducted in a different register. The practical losses were tallied, certainly, but the law fragments from raider communities in the post-conflict period are more focused on the relational and cultural dimensions of what had happened. What had it meant that the underground institutions they had been operating alongside had turned on them? What did that mean for how they should structure their relationships with those institutions going forward? What obligations did they have to the communities that had not survived the conflict, and what obligations did those communities' survival place on the living? These questions are addressed in the post-conflict fragments with a seriousness that reflects their genuine difficulty. The raider communities had not emerged from the conflict with clean answers. They had emerged with a deeper understanding of what they valued and a clearer sense of what they were not willing to accept. But translating that understanding into practical frameworks for the relationships they now had to manage was not a simple project. It required a kind of institutional building that raider culture was not necessarily well designed for, because raider culture had developed in the context of operating against external threats, not in the context of managing complex ongoing relationships with large institutions. The post-conflict period, taken as a whole, is the law's most explicitly open-ended section. The earlier periods, however fragmentary, have the quality of events that have been processed and understood at some level, even if incompletely. The post-conflict fragments feel more immediate, more caught in the middle of something that has not resolved. The questions they are asking do not have answers yet, and the law does not supply them retrospectively. What remains, in the end, from everything this story has covered, is a surface that has been transformed by forces that none of its inhabitants fully understand. A sky that is never quiet. Communities that have built themselves from necessity and loss into something recognizable and resilient. Institutions that have survived their own worst tendencies and their own worst decisions at significant cost and are trying to find ways to be better than they have been. And an ongoing presence in that sky that does not know or care about any of it. The conflict between the military and the raider communities was, in one reading, a catastrophic waste. Resources, lives, trust, and time that could not be recovered. In another reading, it was the process by which two communities fundamentally different in culture and institutional structure discovered the conditions under which they could actually work together. Not comfortable conditions, not conditions that anyone would have chosen, but conditions that created, through necessity and loss, a working relationship that had not existed before and that would be required going forward. ARC is still there, the surface is still hostile, the machines are still falling, and the people who choose to go out into that environment to face what is falling and find what can be recovered are still there too, changed by what they have been through, carrying the specific weight of specific losses, but present. The law does not promise resolution. It does not promise victory. It offers something more modest and in some ways more honest. It offers the record of people who kept going despite everything, who adapted when they had to, who failed in ways that cost them enormously and found ways to continue anyway, who, in the specific and irreducible texture of their individual choices and their individual relationships, made something out of the impossible situation they were in. That is the Ark Raiders story, as best as it can be assembled from the fragments available in one particular interpretation, with one particular emphasis, built by someone who found the human story inside the machine story to be the more compelling one. The machines are extraordinary, but the people are the point. They always are.